I woke up in darkness, heart pounding, the sharp trill of my phone slicing through the quiet. My body was still heavy with sleep, mind sluggish, but my hand found the phone on the nightstand. The screen glowed too bright in the dark, searing the name into my vision. Mom. A strange feeling tightened in my chest. It wasn't unusual for her to call late, especially when she couldn't sleep, but something about this moment felt wrong. A fog of grogginess dulled my instincts, but still I answered. The line connected. Nothing but static. Not the usual soft hum of a poor connection. This had depth, layers. A thick, distorted sound, as though something was pressing against the silence, trying to be heard. Beneath the hiss and crackle, something else lurked, a faint distortion, an uneven rhythm, like breathing that wasn't quite human. I swallowed against a dry throat. Mom. The word barely left my lips before the call cut off abruptly. The screen went black. For a long moment, I lay there staring at it, heartbeat steady but uneasy. It was probably a mistake, I told myself. A pocket dial or her phone glitching. Maybe she had already fallen asleep again. I should have left it alone, let the pull of exhaustion drag me back under, but my fingers were already dialing back. Straight to voicemail. A deep pit settled in my stomach. My mother was never one to turn off her phone. Even when she slept, she kept the ringer on, just in case. I tried again, and again. Nothing. I exhaled, shaking my head as if I could shake off the unease with it. It was late. My mind was overreacting. There was probably an explanation, one that wouldn't seem half as ominous in the daylight. I placed the phone back on my nightstand and closed my eyes. The room felt colder than before, an odd chill slipping beneath the blankets. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and restless. Every so often, I thought I heard something just outside the edge of my hearing. A soft murmur, a whisper beneath the hum of my bedroom fan. I told myself it was my imagination. Morning came too fast, sunlight bleeding through the curtains, pulling me from uneasy dreams. My head felt thick, like I hadn't slept at all, blinking against the brightness. I reached for my phone automatically, eyes still adjusting. Several missed calls, all from my aunt. My stomach lurched. There was a weight to those missed calls, a silent urgency pressing down on me before I even tapped the screen. The moment the call connected, I knew. I didn't need to hear the words. The sound of her crying was enough. Mom was gone. She had passed in her sleep. At exactly 2 a.m., the world blurred at the edges. My aunt's voice, thick with grief, barely registered as I sat there gripping my phone with white-knuckled hands. It didn't make sense. My mother had been fine just yesterday. She had laughed over the phone, complained about a TV show, asked if I was eating properly. There had been no warnings, no signs. Now she was gone. A hollow feeling pressed against my ribs. I barely remembered hanging up, barely recalled the moment I let my phone slip from my fingers and rest in my lap. My mind felt detached from my body, thoughts spiraling in a slow, surreal haze. Then something whispered at the edge of my mind. The call, the one from her number. I snatched the phone up, breath tight in my throat. The screen lit up, but when I opened my call log, my body went cold. The incoming call wasn't there. No record of it. No missed call. No sign that she had ever dialed my number at 2 a.m. For a long moment, I simply stared, hoping I had made some mistake. Maybe my phone had glitched. Maybe I had dreamed it, half conscious and lost in the haze of sleep. But I knew better. The call had been real. I had seen her name on my screen, had heard the deep, layered static on the other end. My fingers moved on their own, swiping over to my voicemail inbox. And there it was. A single, new voicemail, timestamped at exactly 2 a.m. I hesitated. The air in my apartment felt heavier, as if the walls were leaning and just slightly pressing against me. A dull hum filled my ears, the same sound I remembered from last night, like the remnants of a fading dream. My hands trembled as I pressed play. Static. At first, it was just a low crackling, deep and uneven. White noise, but wrong. It wasn't uniform. It swelled in certain places, warped and thick, as though something was shifting beneath it, pressing against the sound. A distortion. Then, buried within the static, something else. A voice. Not quite a whisper, not quite a word. Faint, but unmistakable. The syllables stretched and cracked, distant but deliberate, forming just 3 words. Don't let him in. Then silence. The recording cut off abruptly. No fade out. No background noise. Just an unnatural stop, as if something had cut the message short. My breath hitched. My thumb hovered over the replay button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it again. Those words burned into my brain, replaying on their own. Don't let him in. The way the voice had warped at the edges, stretching unnaturally, as though something else had been speaking beneath it. It hadn't sounded like my mother. I swallowed hard. My chest felt too tight, the air too thin. Who had left this message? I turned the phone over in my hands, as if looking at it from a different angle would reveal some hidden truth. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. Maybe it had been a corrupted voicemail, a glitch in the network, an old message that had resurfaced for no reason. But the timestamp wouldn't change. The words wouldn't change. My mother's final words to me, sent after she had already died. The room suddenly felt too quiet. I tried to push the growing unease aside, try to convince myself that grief was making my mind race to conclusions that weren't there. I told myself that when I got to my mother's house, things would make sense. My aunt would tell me more, would explain how it had happened, would give me something solid to hold on to. Instead, she told me something worse. The front door had been wide open when they found her. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet that night. Every shadow stretched too long. Every distant noise from the street outside made my pulse jump. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying my mother's voice over and over in my mind. Don't let him in. The voicemail still sat on my phone, untouched since I had first listened to it. I hadn't deleted it. I couldn't. Every time I thought about playing it again, something deep in my gut recoiled, as if listening to it one more time would somehow make things worse. I checked my call log again, hoping that somehow, by some trick of memory, I'd find evidence of the call from my mother. But there was nothing. No trace that my phone had rung at 2 a.m. Only the voicemail remained. I turned the phone over, set it on my nightstand, and tried to force my mind to stillness. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, the numbers on my digital clock burned into my vision, ticking forward in slow, taunting increments. 12:34, 1:07, 1:48. I didn't want to see what happened when it reached 2 o'clock, but time didn't care. When the numbers shifted, my body went rigid. 2 a.m. Then came a knock. A single, sharp rap against my front door. The sound cut through the silence, snapping the air like a taut wire. My chest tightened. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one should be here at this hour. I lay completely still, breath held, listening. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe a drunk neighbor knocking on a wrong door. Maybe some package delivered absurdly late. I swallowed, pushing myself upright, my body cold despite the sweat on my palms. Another knock. Slow, deliberate. I turned toward my bedroom door, the space beyond it suddenly feeling vast, unfamiliar. The air felt different, heavier, as if something were pressing against the walls, straining to be let inside. I forced myself to move, swinging my legs over the bed. The floor felt ice-cold beneath my bare feet. Each step toward the front door felt too loud, the silence around me stretching, amplifying the sound of my own breathing. I reached the peephole. A figure stood just beyond the threshold. Tall, motionless. The hallway light behind them was dim, but I could make out their outline. A dark silhouette, featureless, standing too still. They weren't shifting their weight or adjusting their posture like a normal person. They just stood there, waiting. A deep unease crawled through me, something primal that I couldn't explain. Every instinct screamed at me not to open the door. Then my phone buzzed. I flinched, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. Unknown number. I hesitated. Some small, terrified part of me begged me not to answer. But I did. The static came first. The same deep, layered distortion from the voicemail, swelling and shifting like it was alive. My breath caught in my throat. Then the whisper. Let me in. I nearly dropped the phone. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the silence that followed. The knocking stopped. I forced myself to look through the peephole again. The figure was gone, but something inside me knew it wasn't over. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of my bed, gripping my phone, staring at the door, waiting for anything to happen. The hours bled together. My nerves stretched thin until morning finally crept through the blinds. As soon as the sun rose, I checked my security camera footage. At 2 a.m., the screen was black. Not empty, not corrupted, black, as if something had been standing right in front of the camera, blocking everything out. The sleepless night left me drained, my body moving on autopilot through the motions of the morning. My mind, however, remained sharp, frayed at the edges, but too alert to ignore the gnawing questions in my gut. The figure at the door, the voicemail, the black screen on the security footage. Each piece fit together, but I didn't know what kind of picture they were forming. I needed answers. By the time I arrived at my mother's house, the day had settled into an eerie quiet. The place already felt frozen in time. Her coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter, the throw blanket on the couch folded exactly the way she always left it. The weight of absence pressed down on everything. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I needed to understand. I moved through the house with purpose, checking drawers, cabinets, closets, anywhere she might have kept something important. It wasn't until I reached her bedroom that I found something. The box was tucked away in the back of her closet, buried beneath old clothes and yellowing newspapers. It was heavier than it looked. I pulled it out, dust swirling in the air as I lifted the lid. Inside were old photographs, letters, keepsakes from a life that suddenly felt like it had an entire hidden side I'd never known about. But one thing caught my eye immediately. An old cassette tape. The label, written in my mother's careful handwriting, read, 1976, don't forget. My fingers tightened around the plastic edges. A cold unease settled in my chest. This tape wasn't just old. It looked worn, as if it had been played countless times. I found her old tape recorder in the same box, its buttons stiff with age. I slid the cassette in, hesitated, then pressed play. The static returned. Thick, layered, alive. It wasn't the usual white noise. It had depth, a shape that shifted as if something lurked beneath it, pressing against the edges of the sound. Then, buried within the distortion, a voice. My mother's. Younger. Frightened. She spoke in a hushed, hurried tone, as if whispering something forbidden. The words came in a shaky breath. I saw him. I heard him through the radio. He only comes when you listen. The tape hissed, the sound warping, stretching unnaturally. Then, without warning, it rewound itself. The sharp whir of the tape spinning backward made my skin crawl. My hands hovered over the stop button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. The tape played again. This time, the voice wasn't my mother's. The sound crawled through the speaker, thick and inhuman. The words were wrong, as if something else had spoken them, but couldn't quite mimic human speech. You already let me in. The tape stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the static. A slow, creeping dread slid down my spine. My mother had known something. She had recorded this as a warning, not just for herself, but for me. She had tried to keep something out, tried to bury it in static, but now I had listened. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I flinched, heart hammering against my ribs. The screen glowed too bright in the dim room. Unknown caller. The hesitation lasted only a second before my thumb moved on its own, answering the call. The static was deafening. The static didn't stop. It filled the speaker, expanding, deepening a sound that wasn't just noise. It was presence. Something pressed through it, something just beyond recognition. The pressure built in my ears, in my skull, in my mind. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body rigid as I held the phone, unable to move, unable to hang up. Then suddenly it cut off. Silence swallowed the room. I let the phone slip from my grip. The weight in my chest didn't leave. It only sank deeper. The house had changed. It wasn't anything obvious. The walls were still the same, the furniture untouched. But the air was different. It felt charged, thick with something unseen. The shadows stretched just a little too long. The corners of the room held shapes that hadn't been there before. I turned toward the hallway mirror. My reflection lagged. A blink too slow, a movement that wasn't quite my own. I swallowed hard, stepping forward, watching it with wide, unblinking eyes. The glass seemed murky, darker than it should have been, as if I was looking into something deeper than my own reflection. Then it moved when I didn't. A flicker of motion, subtle, but unmistakable. My breath hitched. The muscles in my face were frozen, but my reflection's lips parted. I turned away before I could see what happened next. The house seemed larger now. The hallway stretched, the doors farther apart than they should have been. My mother's bedroom door stood ajar, the crack of darkness inside impossibly deep. Something shifted in the corner of my vision. A shadow, watching. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. A blink, and then it was nighttime. The sudden shift sent a jolt through my system. My body lagged, my mind stuttering to catch up. The sun had been shining through the windows just a second ago. Now, the world was swallowed in darkness, the only illumination coming from the dim glow of my phone screen. I lost time. The clock on the wall read 1:59 a.m. Something inside me knew. 2 minutes. I reached for my phone with shaking hands. My fingers felt numb, the weight of it wrong in my grasp. I barely registered my own breathing, too focused on the glowing screen. 2 Uhr nachts. The phone rang. Mom. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. I didn't want to answer. I couldn't, but my thumb moved on its own, pressing the button before I could stop it. The line connected. There was no static this time, only silence. Then a voice. Not hers. It spoke in a tone that sent ice through my veins, a voice that barely held onto the shape of words, stretching them, warping them, something ancient trying to mimic something human. You should have never listened. The lights went out. The air in the room shifted. The weight of it settled on my chest, on my skin, pressing against every inch of me. My breath hitched as I heard it, the sound of my front door unlocking. A slow, deliberate click, then another, the latch sliding free, the doorknob turning. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The phone in my hand vibrated violently, and the screen lit up on its own. A voicemail. It played before I could touch it. The message looped over and over, each word burrowing deeper, repeating itself in a voice that was no longer my mother's. Don't let him in. Don't let him in. Don't let him in. The screen cut to static.